Veteran Marcus Collins, a resident of South Point, a small town tucked away in the woods of North Carolina, had until recently been a symbol of stability and respect. His life was predictable but dignified. Collins, a former combatant, took pride in his service to the country and considered his family the greatest achievement of his life. Neighbors respected him for his selflessness and strength, and his children and grandchildren always returned home to celebrate family festivities. On his 68th birthday, Marcus received an unexpected gift from his youngest son, Daniel. It was a DNA test kit. Daniel, passionate about genealogy, wanted to learn more about his family roots, convinced that it would strengthen his connection to the past. Marcus accepted the gift with humor and, without thinking much, sent a sample for analysis. 2 weeks later, the results arrived by email. At first glance, the document seemed formal: tables, graphs and figures. However, among that data, Marcus discovered something that completely changed his perception of life. The findings clearly and conclusively indicated that there was no genetic relationship between him and his children. The news left him in a state of shock. Accustomed to basing his decisions on facts and logic, Marcus could not find an explanation for this result. His first reaction was to look for a logical reason. Perhaps there was an error in the laboratory or the test was performed incorrectly. He read the report several times, comparing the data with the instructions, but everything confirmed the veracity of the conclusions. For several days, Collins tried to remain calm, but his quiet life began to crack. He spent more and more time in his office, reviewing old photos and family documents. Memories of happy times with his family now seemed distorted to him. Every moment, from his children's first steps to their graduations, had lost the solid foundation that supported his confidence in the past. When Marcus decided to share the results with his wife, Rebecca's reaction only increased his suspicions. She did not deny the data, but she avoided answering directly. That moment marked the beginning of a breakup that threatened to destroy his family life. Thus began a chain of events that would not only change his home, but also the entire town of South Point, turning Marcus Collins' life into a tragedy that would remain etched in the memories of the inhabitants for a long time. After receiving the results of the DNA test, Marcus could not find peace. His days were filled with disturbing thoughts and his nights with insomnia. Before addressing the issue with his family, he decided to delve into the past to confirm or refute his suspicions. A man of discipline and method, Marcus began to search for answers in documents and memories that could shed light on what had happened. The first thing he did was go up to the attic and take out old family albums. In the photographs he looked for something that indicated some difference between him and his children. In some images taken decades ago, certain insignificant details at the time caught his attention: an elusive look from Rebecca or the overly friendly attitude of his neighbor, Peter Miller, who used to be frequently invited to family celebrations. These small gestures, which had previously gone unnoticed, now took on a disturbing significance. Marcus then looked through documents and letters stored in Rebecca's desk. He found several letters signed by Peter, that old neighbor and family friend. The letters had a personal tone, full of warm words and, at times, a closeness that was too much. Based on the dates, some of them were written during Marcus's long absences due to his military service. Each line seemed to contain a veiled threat that confirmed his worst fears. Marcus recalled moments when Rebecca avoided talking about certain topics from the past and situations when Peter showed particular concern for his family. Small details, once irrelevant, now formed a clear picture of betrayal. Unable to bear the pressure, Marcus called his eldest daughter, Julia, to talk about the results of the DNA test. He showed her the document and, in a serious tone, explained that, according to the analysis, he was not the biological father of any of her children. Julia was taken aback. Her initial reaction was to hesitate, to look for a logical explanation. But Marcus's logic and the overwhelming facts made the situation irrefutable. After the conversation with Julia, Marcus made the decision to reunite the entire family. He knew that the truth about his children's ancestry could destroy family trust, but he considered it useless to continue hiding it. The weight of the discovered facts generated a tension that could no longer be ignored. The family meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Marcus prepared everything in advance. The results of the DNA test were in the center of the large dining room table in his old house. He insisted that all 4 of his children attend, including Karen, who had traveled from a nearby town. Now Marcus could only prepare for the inevitable showdown, the consequences of which could be devastating. Thomas arrived late for work. The atmosphere in the house was tensely calm, like the stillness before a storm. Every member of the family felt the weight of the moment, but no one knew what to expect. When everyone was present, Marcus, standing by the table, began to speak. His voice was firm, but heavy with gravity. He briefly explained that he had recently taken a DNA test and that the results showed that none of his children were biologically his. These words fell like a devastating blow. Julia, who already knew the truth, kept a tense expression, while Karen and Thomas exchanged glances of disbelief. Daniel remained silent, as if he had not yet assimilated what he had heard. After a brief pause, Marcus added, "I have tried for days to find an explanation for this. The only thing I can think of is that we have been living a lie for decades." His gaze fell on Rebecca, who remained silent with her head down. Marcus's eyes demanded answers. Rebecca was the one to break the silence. Her voice, usually soft and calm, now sounded muffled and tense. She confessed that, indeed, each of her children had a different biological father. Her words were like a bolt from the blue. Julia covered her face with her hands. Karen abruptly stood up from the table, and Thomas, with his fists clenched, seemed to barely contain his anger. Only Daniel remained motionless, paralyzed by shock.
Chaos broke out. Karen demanded explanations. Thomas accused his mother of betrayal. And Julia tried to calm everyone down. Although her voice was drowned out in the tumult. Rebecca tried to justify her actions as youthful mistakes. But each word of hers only increased the tension. Marcus watched the scene in silence. His anger had reached its limit. But he remained calm. Aware that his family was irreparably broken. After Rebecca's confession, he realized that the core of this tragedy was outside his home. Peter Miller's name came back to him as the ultimate proof of deception. The meeting ended in complete disarray. No one could reach a conclusion or find solace. But Marcus knew what his next step would be: confront Peter. The man who symbolized all his shattered illusions. Marcus Collins approached Peter Miller's house with a heavy heart and unwavering determination. He had spent the entire night going over the events of the past few days, the revealed betrayal, Rebecca's confession, the confused expressions of his children. All of it had pushed him to make a definitive decision. To Marcus, Peter was the symbol of deceit. The man who had destroyed his family from within. Peter's house looked as peaceful as ever, impeccably clean windows, a well-kept garden, and a small terrace with a rocking chair. But to Marcus, that place now represented only deceit and betrayal. He knocked on the door. And moments later, Peter opened it. Seeing Marcus, he showed a bewildered expression, but calmly invited him in. Marcus crossed the threshold. The room was silent, only interrupted by the slight creaking of the floor beneath his steps. Peter seemed cautious, but he tried to maintain his composure. Marcus wasted no time in formalities and got straight to the point, laying out everything he knew: the results of the DNA test, Rebecca's confession, and her past relationship with Peter. Every word was sharp and harsh. At first, Peter denied everything. But under Marcus's pressure he began to relent. His voice cracked as he admitted that there had indeed been a relationship between him and Rebecca. He tried to justify himself, saying that it had all happened many years ago and that it was of no importance. But those words only further inflamed Marcus's anger. The tension quickly rose. Marcus stood up from his chair and took a step forward. His gaze was overwhelmingly intense. Peter, realizing the gravity of the situation, raised his hands in a gesture of conciliation. But by then Marcus was no longer listening. In his mind only one word echoed: betrayal. The accumulation of repressed emotions in Marcus finally reached its breaking point. He approached Peter. And their eyes met. A loud, dry sound broke the silence. Like an unexpected thunderclap. Moments later, the room was enveloped in an eerie stillness. When Marcus left the house, his steps were heavy. And the air was heavy with an unspoken truth. Inside, in an empty room, Peter remained. Who would never be able to tell his side of the story. This act did not bring Marcus the relief he had hoped for. Instead, he only felt an emptiness expanding within him. He knew that the consequences would be inevitable and that his life would never be the same again. He left the house behind, leaving a trail of silence that reflected the magnitude of the tragedy. After Peter Miller's death, Marcus Collins returned home in a state that was far from calm. His steps, usually firm, were now slow and heavy. As he opened the door, he felt the weight of his actions becoming more and more unbearable. The house greeted him with a deathly silence, broken only by the faint flickering of a desk lamp that illuminated the gloom. Rebecca, noticing Marcus had returned, immediately left the kitchen. She saw her husband's stained clothes and instantly understood that something had happened. The tense expression on Rebecca's face and her intuition told her that something terrible had happened. Trying to ask, she was met with a cold, distant gaze. Marcus walked past without a word and plopped down on the old leather couch in the living room. As if he didn't feel the weight beneath his body. Rebecca, unable to contain her concern, walked over. Her voice trembled as she asked him what had happened. But Marcus didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on one point, as if trying to understand how he had come to this moment. Images of the loss of her family and her shattered hopes flashed through her mind over and over again. Each memory struck like a hammer, leaving deep cracks in her spirit. Rebecca tried again to break the silence. But her words seemed more like pleas than questions. She wanted to understand, to know what had happened. However, her attempts only intensified the tension. Suddenly, Marcus stood up. His movements were abrupt, almost automatic. He looked at Rebecca, and in his gaze she perceived a mixture of pain, anger and exhaustion. What happened next marked a definitive turn in the family's destiny. A second of silence stretched out like an eternity. And the house shook with a sound that broke the tranquility of the night. In the living room, illuminated by the soft light of the lamp, an eerie stillness reigned now. Marcus looked down at what was once his support and his family. After that, he remained motionless, as if he himself could not believe what he had done. An oppressive silence took over the room. It seemed that even the walls understood the magnitude of the horror that had just occurred. Slowly, Marcus lowered the gun, his hands trembled. That night became the point of no return for him. Everything he once considered the foundation of his life had completely crumbled. The house, once filled with love and laughter, was now the scene of a tragedy. At dawn, consumed by dark thoughts, Marcus sat at the table and wrote a short letter. In it, he confessed his actions and expressed his willingness to accept any punishment. After finishing it, he called the police to inform them of what had happened. By this time, he already knew that the consequences of his actions were inevitable and would haunt him until the end of his days. In the early morning, Marcus Collins' house, surrounded by the dense woods of South Point, was cordoned off by police vehicles. The sound of sirens broke the silence. disturbing the quiet routine of the small town. On the porch, sitting in an old rocking chair, was Marcus. His gaze was distant, as if he were lost in thought. Next to him, on a small table, rested the gun, a silent witness to what had happened. The police officers approached cautiously. Marcus, seeing them, slowly raised his hands, without saying a word. His attitude showed neither fear nor resistance. The officers, mindful of his veteran background, acted cautiously. One of them quietly said to him, "Marcus, this will be resolved in court." Collins simply nodded, remaining absorbed in his inner world. Inside the house, the officers found Rebecca Collins, who was lying in a state that confirmed the tragic conclusion of recent events. The room where everything happened was eerily silent. On the kitchen table, there was a letter in which Marcus confessed his actions and explained his motives. In it, he described how his life had fallen apart after discovering the results of the DNA test and hearing Rebecca's confession. But the tragedy did not end there. In the letter, he also mentioned the location where Peter Miller's body was found. The police officers went to the indicated location and soon confirmed that Peter had been found dead in his house. Everything indicated that a confrontation had occurred between Marcus and Peter that had a fatal outcome. These events shocked the entire South Point. A town accustomed to calm was shaken by a tragedy that destroyed one of its most respected families. The Collins neighbors were in disbelief. Many remembered Marcus as a kind and honest man, incapable of committing violent acts. Marcus' children received the news with shock and pain. Julia, the eldest, took on the responsibility of organizing the funerals and maintaining contact with the police. Thomas closed himself off, avoiding speaking to the family. Karen and Daniel tried to understand how to move on after such a tragedy. Each felt that their world had been destroyed, facing the arduous task of dealing with the weight of the revealed truth. For Marcus, this was the end of his path. He was aware that his actions had not only ruined his life, but also that of his children. Now, he was left only with the solitude of his cell, where every moment reflected the magnitude of what he had done. The small town of South Point was never the same again. The Collins tragedy remained etched in the collective memory as a reminder of how secrets and betrayals can destroy even the most united families. Marcus Collins' trial attracted the attention not only of the residents of South Point, but also of journalists from neighboring towns. The man who had been considered by many to be a paragon of virtue was now in the dock, facing charges of a double homicide. This case became a symbol of how the weight of emotions and the revelation of secrets hidden for years could lead to tragedy. On the first day of the trial, Marcus entered the courtroom with an eerie calm. He was dressed in dark, plain clothes, and his face showed neither regret nor anger. He seemed to have accepted his fate even before the judge called the courtroom to order. His expression was that of a man who no longer sought to justify his actions, he just wanted it all to be over. During the trial, the prosecution presented compelling evidence, including the results of the ballistics test, Marcus' confession letter, and testimony from neighbors. One of the prosecution's main arguments was that Marcus' actions had been premeditated. The prosecution stressed that Marcus had gone to Peter Miller's house with the clear intention of confronting him, which ultimately led to the tragic outcome. The defense attorney took a different approach, describing Marcus as a man who had dedicated his entire life to serving his country and his family, but who had been destroyed by a devastating revelation. The defense emphasized Marcus' emotional state, arguing that his actions were not the result of cold calculation, but of a deep personal breakdown. Testimony from Marcus' children was a key moment in the trial. Julia, the eldest, spoke with tears in her eyes, describing what a loving father Marcus had been and the impact the revelation of the DNA test had had on them. Thomas, while supportive of his father, was more reserved, avoiding going into details. His words made it clear that the tragedy had broken not only Marcus, but the entire family. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. After analyzing the evidence and arguments from both sides, the judge declared that while Marcus' motivations were understandable, his actions could not be justified. The sentence was harsh: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reaction to the verdict was divided. For some townspeople, Marcus was still a victim of deception, while for others he was a criminal who had turned his grief into violence. For Marcus, however, the sentence was not a surprise. As he left the courtroom, he walked with his head down, as if he had fully accepted the consequences of his actions. After Marcus Collins' trial and sentencing, life in South Point was never the same. Marcus' story left a deep scar, becoming a recurring topic of conversation among the townspeople. The town, accustomed to tranquility, became a reminder of how hidden secrets can destroy the most precious thing. Marcus' children, now orphaned by their parents, faced difficult consequences. Julia, the eldest, tried to take on the responsibility of keeping the family together. But the task proved overwhelming. The bonds that once seemed unbreakable had crumbled. Karen, the middle daughter, distanced herself from everyone, preferring to move away from South Point to start over. Thomas and Daniel barely communicated, each withdrew into their own world, struggling to process the weight of the truth that had come to light. The Collins house, once filled with love and warmth, was left empty. Its dark windows and worn paint on the facade were a silent testimony to what had happened. Neighbors, passing by her, slowed down, remembering the events that had shocked the town. In prison, Marcus led a quiet life. He did not get involved in conflicts or talk much with the other inmates. His days were monotonous, filled with reflection and reading. He avoided justifying his actions, aware that nothing could change what had happened. His silence was a reflection of the emptiness that had been left inside him after the tragedy. Over time, the inhabitants of South Point began to see this story as a lesson. At the local school, activities were even held to discuss the consequences of lying and the importance of family trust. The Collins story became a warning to future generations, a reminder of how the truth, although painful, is preferable to lies that can destroy lives. For Marcus' children, this was not just a lesson. It was their reality. Years later, Julia tried to rebuild ties with her siblings. She wrote letters to Karen and called Thomas, trying to regain the connection lost in the midst of the tragedy. But the process of reconciliation was long and painful. Each attempt was a reminder of what they had lost and the wounds that had yet to heal. The Collins' story did not end with final closure, but with a lingering wound that would continue to remind them how a family had been forever destroyed. Now, this story was part of South Point, a silent testament that sometimes the truth can hurt deeper than any lie.